Good evening. My name is Ryan Short, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples that lived on these lands, as well as the thousands of Indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 as a part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum, the Center of Spirituality and Social Justice, the Asbel Center for Jewish Life, and the Department of Religion, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Public Engagement, Organizing, and the Role of Faith-Based Institutions. This event will take place in conversation with Dr. Cody Nelson, Executive Director of the Center of Spirituality and Social Justice. It is also the keynote for Dickinson's annual Multi-Faith Week. Having attended Catholic schools for most of my life, I am no stranger to faith-based institutions. My Catholic school instilled in me within a desire to engage in my community in an active and compassionate way. While I experienced some challenges attending these institutions, I loved the emphasis on service to my community. I learned how religious institutions can make a big impact on the community, from food drives to tutoring. Michael Pappas, an alumnus of Dickinson College, is currently the Executive Director of San Francisco Interfaith Council. Pappas worked as a lobbyist, a regional field director for a presidential campaign, and an investment banker before becoming an ordained Greek Orthodox priest. During his 16-year ministry, he contributed to numerous religious and secular periodicals and devoted energy to work with the homeless. He now works to build ecumenical and interfaith relationships. Some of his previous and current board memberships include mayoral appointments to the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, San Francisco Disaster Council, and San Francisco Office of Civic Engagement 2010 and 2020 Census Complete Count Committees. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. For students participating in the Passport program, please scan the QR code on the back of the program to track your attendance through Engaged. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. In the event of an emergency, please note that the accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. At this time, I will ask that you please silence all cell phones and electronic devices. And now, please welcome Michael Pappas.
Ryan, I want to thank you in particular for the investment that you have put in this particular forum, as well as the Clark Forum and Gary Kirk and Sarah Markowitz in particular, and my dear friend Cody Nielsen of the Center for Spirituality and Social Justice, as well as the Asbel Center for Jewish Life and the Department of Religion. I think today is really the culmination of a week here at Dickinson, and I am feeling incredible gratitude. I've not been here for 40 years. And my time here has been transformative and is filled with appreciation. I'm also very appreciative of the students that are here tonight, because I know that you are in the middle of midterms, and so your presence here tonight is truly a gift. Tonight is intended to be interactive. I'm going to say a few words here, but then Cody and I will have a back and forth, and I'm hoping that as you listen to this presentation and listen to the dialogue, that there might be some questions you'll have. And I will come into this saying, when I was growing up, my parents used to say the two things that you don't talk about in polite conversation are politics and religion. We're going to talk about them a lot tonight, and how I'm going to try to make a case to the fact that they are interdependent. I am very cognizant of the fact that I come from San Francisco, and we have a unique model of doing interfaith work and collaborating with our local civic partners. And each of our interfaith councils throughout the United States, most of them are in metropolitan areas, usually form in response to something. Ours is no exception. The Interfaith Council in San Francisco formed over 34 years ago in response to a homeless crisis. The mayor of the city at that time and I joke because he was Greek like myself and knew how to use guilt effectively, invited faith leaders into his office and basically said, we have an emerging homeless crisis, and you are religious people. You have a moral obligation to be part of the response. Open your doors, provide a meal, provide kindness and dignity, which is in your DNA, and be part of the solution. So what started out as a one-year emergency shelter is now in its 34th year, entering into its 34th year. And we can talk about that a little more as we have a dialogue. The following year, we had the Loma Prieta earthquake, and more people got displaced, and the homeless crisis in San Francisco was exacerbated. I really feel that the foundation for some of the challenges San Francisco has today with homelessness have their roots back at that time. And a humanitarian aid organization by the name of Church World Service had monies that they wanted to disperse to those who had been displaced by the earthquake. And lo and behold, the same people that were in the mayor's office found themselves at Calvary Presbyterian Church up on Fillmore Street in Pacific Heights in San Francisco. And that was the formation of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, a response to a homeless crisis and a response to a disaster. And that speaks greatly to who we are, what our ethos is. The mission of the organization is to bring people of different faiths together to celebrate our rich, diverse spiritual and religious traditions, to build understanding, and to serve our community. Our constituents comprise of the 800 communities of faith and religious institutions in San Francisco. And to break that down further, they're not just the houses of worship, but in addition, what we call judicatories, like the Catholic Archdiocese, the Episcopal Diocese of California, the United Muslims of America, the Northern California Board of Rabbis, and umbrella organizations that are headquartered in San Francisco and have a geographical reach. We also work very, very closely with the academic and healthcare-related, religiously affiliated organizations. And beginning in the Great Recession of 2008, we began to convene the CEOs of the faith-based social service agencies that provide the safety net for San Francisco's most vulnerable residents. And those organizations are the ones that have the contracts with the city to provide the social services to our most needy. And so you can see, it could be argued that our civic partners called us into existence and at the same time rely upon us. Our unique model for doing interfaith work is to speak on behalf of no one, but to give a voice to everyone. And I know that Cody and I will be delving into that with a little more seriousness as the evening progresses. I did want to ask for you to humor me for a moment, and if I could indulge you to take a deep breath, relax, and if you feel comfortable, close your eyes for a moment because I would like to transport you to San Francisco with me. At the beginning of every one of our interfaith gatherings, we read this statement. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer a prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world. Welcome home. For us, the value of cultivating relationships among people of faith and the value of holding sacred space so people can come together in our convening role, in our connecting role, is priceless. And with that, I would invite Cody to come, and we will use the balance of our time for exchange, and I look forward to your questions at the end of our exchange.
Thank you, Michael. See if the mic is on. There it is. Good. So thank you for that. I think we can all hold that sort of space of deep breathing and thinking about this. You know, Michael, you said it's been 40 years. That's a long time since you stood on the campus of Dickinson, since you came here on Monday afternoon or Monday evening. I think if we're going to really delve into this story, we need to know a little bit about filling in the gaps between this. So can you just enlighten us with the most, brief, telling us how did you end up in San Francisco doing this work after being at Dickinson in the late 70s and early 1980s?
And you suggested economy of words.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so I will be respectful and I will be faithful to that
Go.
as much as I can. I have to tell you, being back on campus after 40 years has been a gift. My time here was precious. I was asked this morning if Dickinson prepared me for a life in the world. And I have to tell you, the class I sat in on, nobody had ever asked me that question. And I stopped, and I began to cry, because Dickinson did. Dickinson did. While I was here, I was very active in the newspaper, the Dickinsonian, news and associate editor in my first 2 years. We had a very active fraternity system here, so I was involved with the Interfraternity Council and then was the Student Senate president in my last 2 years. When I left, I spent 12 weeks in law school and realized that this is not something you do for mom and dad. And then came back and worked for a lobbying firm. And 6 months later, my boss was named executive director of New Jersey Reagan Bush 84. And I've worked through being the the Northern New Jersey field director, who was responsible for Get Out the Vote, was responsible for voter registration and advance of the candidates when they came into our neck of the woods. After that, I was recruited by the oldest bond firm in New Jersey to be at first a broker and then vice president of investment banking. It was at that time that I found myself in New York City, and very late at night, I was on a New York City subway, and I realized I was going in the wrong direction. Perhaps that was a metaphor for my life at that point. And I got off of the train to cross over to get onto the new train, and a man was yelling at the top of his lungs, and he was flailing his arms. And one of his arms came into contact with my ribs. And I found myself windless, face down in a puddle on a platform. And the guard who came to pick me up said, "Sir, I don't know what to say to you. President Reagan said if this man takes his medications, he'll be fine, but he lives down here." With that, I had a crisis of consciousness, which led me to seminary. It was that seminary experience that gave me the occasion really to think a lot about the work for the homeless that I really, and interfaith work that I wanted to pursue the rest of my life. Now, you can tease out other parts, but that is how I got to seminary. In the Orthodox Church, you can marry prior to ordination, but not afterward. So the clock was ticking, and I did so. I disclosed to my fiancée then something that I had been wrestling with since the age of 12, that I was wrestling with issues of orientation. These were different times. They were times when we didn't talk about these things. And they were times that we just got on with it and did our thing. And so I was, I would say, rather successful Greek Orthodox priest, spending 3 years in Chicago, 10 years in Stockton, California, and my final 3 years in San Francisco. That's how I got to San Francisco. I was outed. I was telling some of the people out on Britain yesterday that we don't get our own day, no coming out day, no outed day. And that began a real journey of authenticity, and it led me to the job that I have now, because I had served on the board of the Interfaith Council for 3 years as a trustee, and in that time, it was a volunteer organization. And so we decided at that point, while I was a trustee, that we would explore hiring a full-time director, never thinking it was going to be me. And I was asked by the chairman of the board if he could share my story with the members of the board of trustees. And I said, of course. I said, but do it not corporately. Do it one by one. Because I don't want anybody to feel pressure in a corporate setting to say yes. If anyone felt that I couldn't do my job because of my journey, if that was going to be an impediment or who I was, I would voluntarily withdraw my name from consideration. Interestingly, unanimously, they extended that invitation. And that was a year before what in San Francisco and in California we were wrestling with something called Proposition 8. And it was a proposition that passed that stated marriage is between a man and a woman and no one else. And so interestingly, a year before Prop 8, the San Francisco Interfaith Council hired as their new executive director somebody who had been newly outed. And so you can imagine the diplomacy that I have had to extend, because in San Francisco, we have from the most conservative and orthodox to the most progressive and liberal. And so I have shown respect to both sides, and I have done my job with respect to keeping everybody under the tent. Did that answer your question?
It does.
Was it economy of words?
Kind of.
Okay. I'll be conscious of that.
No, it's good. It's good. You give me lots to work off of. And I think I'm just going to dive sort of straight into that, because your story...
Don't dive too deep.
Well, no,
okay?
no. Your story clearly demonstrates a sort of intersection, and obviously we're talking about organizing and faith-based organizations and the role of sort of social change. And of course, the San Francisco Interfaith Council, as you have already said, was a sort of result in a reaction of needs. I think one of the things that is often such a sort of public discussion right now is the role of religion and politics in one. And I think there are a lot of folks that today have a very, very skittish feeling as though religion should stay out of politics. And I feel like you're running an organization that literally bucks that trend and says that's not possible. So I wonder, what would you say to the sort of naysayers that say religion and politics should not be intermixed?
Well, it would be difficult to be at Dickinson College and not to remember my first class in political philosophy, where we read Aristotle. And Aristotle said, where there are people, there is politics. If you look at what's going on in the country, in places outside of progressive places, religious institutions have a great deal of say. And I will tell you, in the history of, say, for instance, the black church, the pulpit was all that a people had to be able to advance civil rights in America. I would say in the case of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, the relationship is unique because, as I alluded to earlier, we were almost called into existence by the city to help respond to crises. The city understands. I sit in my office and there is a map on the wall with 800 dots. And we are in every neighborhood. And, we have facilities and we have the capacity to mobilize people. And in each one of those dots, good is being done that is benefiting the city. And I would say that the city has been very much made extended invitations to us to be part of their work. And I can tell you myself, I was invited to sit on the Human Rights Commission and Disability and Aging Services. We have half of my board sits on different commissions for the city. The city works very closely with us. And may I give a couple of examples?
Yeah, of course.
The one that is most present right now is the response to the pandemic. I mean, on February 27th, without one case being reported in San Francisco, the mayor of San Francisco declared a state of emergency, wisely, decisively, and she did so because she would be able to redeploy staff and have access to state and federal funding so in order to respond to the pandemic. Well, when she did that, she triggered something called the community branch. And that was a cohort of stakeholders from all different sectors in our city. And basically, then and there, we were deputized as liaisons of the city in order to get out information that would be vital to the safety and protection of the greater populace. And so overnight, we became the CNN, if you will, for the religious sector on all things COVID. We were harvesting the plans of our communities of faith and religious institutions as they saw what they would need to do, but we were also able to get them out. We have 5,600 e-subscribers, and they have their own social networks. And so we were able to get them the information they needed. Literally a week later, they wanted to speak with the faith leaders directly. We didn't know what Zoom was at that time. But we had our first Zoom meeting, and I think we had maybe 250, 300 faith leaders on that call. And after that, the deputy director of public health said, "You have to do this every week." And I laughed at him. I said, "We're a staff of 2. We have a budget of $450,000. We don't have the capacity." And he said, "The city will give you a platform and staff to do this because this is not just a public health crisis. There are equity issues. There are students and academic issues. There are employment issues. And at that time, because of our role, I was invited to be part of the city's Economic Recovery Task Force because we saw the tsunami hitting not only a public health issue, but an economic issue for our city. And so this is just one example of how we have worked collaboratively with our city. And I think that it works and it makes sense because we are a stakeholder in our city.
How many faith-based congregations would you say that you have connections to through this Interfaith Council in San Francisco? How broad of an impact do you think that you're able to reach?
I shared with you the constituencies. Yeah. And our role is that of convener and connector. And I think because we are not advocates per se, that we're keeping everybody under one tent, that it's broad. And as a result of that huge constituency and limited capacity, we've seen a phenomenon that another constituency has emerged, and that is of the interfaith coalitions that have formed around single issues, be they immigration and sanctuary, and I could spend an evening talking about that because we're a sanctuary city, around climate change, around organizing projects, around LGBT issues. And at the risk of sounding paternalistic, we don't look upon them as our competitors, but we see them almost as our children. And as it's appropriate for us to advance their work and to leverage 34 years of trusted relationships, we do, without endorsing everything that they do. So, and I will tell you, among the most fulfilling and rewarding things that we have done is our work with these faith-based social service agencies. When we first started convening them, it was because the city was in a recession. And I remember being at City Hall and the mayor telling me that he would have to cut their budgets by 30% because the money wasn't there. And staff and programs were disappearing. So we brought them together for the first time. And professionally, they were able to talk to one another. We were able to craft a narrative of the collective impact of the benefits that were being extended to San Francisco. And then strangely, something happened. We went from recession to a tech boom. And so the pendulum swung dramatically. Those budgets were never fully reinstated. And all of a sudden, housing prices were going through the roof. People were being forced out of their homes because of evictions, because other people wanted to live where they were living. And staff at these organizations were having to move out as well. So we became an advocate on their behalf because of what they were doing. And so we saw them through that and a number of other issues, and most recently, again, the pandemic.
I think it's really interesting because you're giving a lot of examples about things that are able to be sort of commonly brought together. The pandemic, perhaps climate change, other sort of social issues that are out there that can bind these communities across difference together. That's one thing. We're also dealing with large social issues in which there is true divisiveness. There is an argument that could potentially be made that much of the sort of social discourse is actually different religions sort of in battle against each other. There may be an argument to be made that the recent Dobbs case has a lot of religious overtones and religious influence to it. How is something like what you're doing in a city that is not that religious when it really comes down to, in a state that's not that religious, how do you think that the Interfaith Council is driving people into conversation on issues that are truly divisive across different religious traditions?
Our response to hot button issues, let's call them, takes a couple of different approaches. I sat in a class 2 days ago or yesterday, and I made the overt statement that Dobbs was a religious issue. And I know that that is a bold thing to say, but it was the elephant in the room. How does an interfaith council like San Francisco respond to something like that and keep everybody under the same tent? Well, we took a page from a previous playbook where there was precedent. And for me, in working with my board and making these difficult decisions, I go to the mission statement that I shared with you earlier, and one of the tenets of that mission statement is to build understanding. And so when Dobbs came down, the emotions were high, and for us to say nothing would have been irresponsible. And so what we did is we invited all of the faith traditions to submit the official statements of their particular traditions. And when they couldn't, we would harvest them from the internet when we could find them from their umbrella organizations and the like, and we published them. so everybody could see where different faith traditions stood. We did that without making a judgment, but once again, speaking on behalf of no one, giving a voice to everyone. But more importantly, I think our council has spent 34 years cultivating relationships, trusted relationships. I remember when the Affordable Care Act came out, our member of Congress is the Speaker of the House. And she contacted me when she was first the Speaker of the House and asked if we could assemble a group of faith leaders to talk about the morality of health care. And we did. Following that, one of our board members asked if we could convene a special meeting to talk about just the Affordable Care Act among our board. Because there were some tenets in there that his faith tradition struggled with, wrestled with. And so we did. And the reason why it was a civil discourse, the reason why people listened to one another, was because of the investment that we had made in cultivating those relationships. And I think that at the best, interfaith work is doing just that. In our work, service work, for instance, we have people working together serving the homeless. They might never pick up a book on one another's faith, and all they'll know is what they see in the example of the person they're serving next to them. And for me, and I think for a lot of people, this is the foundation to authentic dialogue, to start there and let it happen organically. Did I answer your question?
You did. You did great. I want to turn this a little bit back to where we are here.
Carlisle.
Okay. Dickinson College. So when we first interacted, so Michael and I have known each other for several years, and Michael contacted me out of the blue on Facebook, and he said, "Do you know where you work?" And I was like, I do. And he said, "I was a graduate of Dickinson," and that was what spurred on this conversation.
I told you to take your shoes off. You're walking on sacred ground.
Something of that
Something
sort,
like
yes.
that.
It's been a long time since you've been here, but you've come a long way in this journey. And I wanted to bring you here to be the keynote speaker for our Multi-Faith Week. What would you say back to Dickinsonians? What would you say back to the broader academy about what we should be learning and knowing about religion and faith communities in today's age that's critical for students that are not going to be religious studies majors, who are not going to go into this? What would you say is the importance? Is there an importance to know about the sort of current ethos of religion and faith communities?
I think you're doing a lot of it already. Your office.
Sure.
Your office. Coming back after 40 years, I have to tell this story.
Yeah.
I'm a storyteller.
Tell the story.
My first day here, I went and ventured to the Hamilton restaurant. And I walked in, and much to my surprise, after 40 years, there was Tommy. He looked great. And I hadn't seen him when his wife passed. I sent my condolences. And he said to me, "You're in California now." Well, let me tell you a little about Tommy and how far Dickinson has come. When I was a student here, I used to stumble in there on a Saturday night after the parties, and he would say to me in Greek, just before I'd leave, "Θα σε δούμε στη γωνία," I'll see you on the corner, which meant that Sunday morning, he and his wife and family would pick up the Greek students and take us to church in Camp Hill, and then come back to their home for a meal. These people worked hard 6 days a week, and this is how they spent their Sabbath day. I was walking out of Denny Hall today, and I saw on a podium, on a pillar there, the Orthodox Christian Fellowship. We didn't have that. We didn't have your office. And I think Dickinson, in its ethos, its beautiful liberal arts, the ethos, wants to expose us to all. I think what you're doing, and this week I've had the occasion to sit in on religion classes, to speak with rabbis, and I am amazed at how far Dickinson has come since 1979 to 1983, and I am pleased. More importantly, the seriousness of the students now, the social justice conscience. I need to share this. We, right after Hurricane Katrina, I was part of a team that went to New Orleans. A Methodist church had been transformed into a storage place for supplies for rebuild. Yep. The Sunday school rooms became bunk beds, and the current students and alumni were doing rebuilds. The current students were the leaders. I joked with some of my alumni colleagues. I said they picked the most incompetent alumni to do drywalling and things like that because we didn't know what we were doing, but we were glad we were there. What struck me was the evolution of students here and the seriousness of resolve. And I think the foundation is there. I am thrilled that Dickinson is bringing on a chief diversity officer. And I can only see the opportunities are galore here. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think if you continue to keep your pulse on what's going on in the world, as Dickinson has always done, and dedicate the resources, as Dickinson is doing, you will continue to shine. Mm-hmm. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
Not a political answer?
No, you can answer however you want. I got one more question for you, and then I know that there might be some questions in the audience.
Let's hope.
Now, if I count 40 years after graduation, that gets you at a certain point.
A reunion.
A reunion.
The problem with coming here now and social media, I posted that I was here, and I've posted all of these different pictures. Are you coming back for the reunion? If I don't, my reunion has happened here.
So my question for you is, now that you've experienced this, have done a lifetime of this, what's next? What do you see the next evolution of the conversations around religious pluralism and the interfaith looking like in a world in which we are under a lot of divisiveness in our political scene, and arguably so within religious movements?
It's interesting you should raise this question, and quite honestly, we did not.
No, I did not tell you I was going to ask that question.
My council, and I think some of them are probably watching tonight, only met for the first time in person in 3 years at a retreat a few weeks ago. For 3 years, we've been living in isolation and on Zoom. Recently, I went to Pacific Heights to interview a prospective candidate for the Board of Trustees from the church that birthed our organization. And after we had spent time talking to her about our organization, she asked a similar question. She said, how do you envision your organization? What are you going to do next? And I said to her, well, naturally, we've been living in isolation. Now we're emerging from a pandemic. It's incumbent upon us to meet, number one, and to start meeting, but also to embark upon a strategic plan because this is not my organization. This organization is only as good as those who comprise it, and we need to listen to them. We need to hear from them, to chart a roadmap. I've been in my position 15 years, 3 years on the board. That's 18 years of a 34-year organization. At some time, there'll have to be succession planning. But for the meantime, we need to hear not only from our board members, but from our external stakeholders, what the needs are in order to create a roadmap for the future. I will be the one to help implement that, but I will not be the one to dictate that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I want to turn it back so the audience can have some questions.
Dickinsonians have never been shy.
I'll begin the question and answer portion of the program. Thank you all so much for coming. Because this event is being recorded and live streamed to many folks out there, make sure you raise your question and wait for a microphone to reach you prior to asking your question. Raise your hand. And then we reserve the first question for students, after which point we will open it up to the rest of the audience. So we are now looking for that first question.
Howdy. So I was curious, in your organization of different faith groups, is there anyone that you feel that you haven't been able to reach, or that you feel you've especially struggled with, like, actually getting close with?
Thank you for asking that question. At dinner tonight, I shared with our hosts that something that San Francisco probably didn't understand, and was flying under the radar, was that during the tech boom, that tech companies were recruiting a lot of people not from San Francisco, a lot of people who might not have felt at home with our progressive ways, and that there was a huge evangelical community in San Francisco. About 15 churches that were renting public spaces and getting about 1,500 young people each at their houses of worship every Sunday, and then a lecture on a Wednesday. And I started showing up and introducing myself and opening the door. That's all I can do. Something that I have found is that there are certain folk whose comfort level with interfaith work and dialogue is not quite there yet. And so I would say that folk at some of the more polar opposites don't come to the table, but the door is open and they are invited. And interestingly, when I was a parish priest in San Francisco, the chairman of the organization came to talk to me, and I asked him, "What do you need to do to become a member of the Interfaith Council?" And he said, "You are by virtue of being, by virtue of existence. We are here for you always." And so sometimes we see some of these wonderful people when there is a civic problem, Sunday metered parking, other things like that, the more mundane things that I hope they don't put on my tombstone. And so I feel my job as the director of the Interfaith Council is to continue to knock at the door and to leave our door open. I hope that that answered the question. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. So much of what you said has resonated with me, and I think something that I keep coming back to and thinking about is people in community coming from different backgrounds, from different places, and that you said you want to like hold those differences and respect each person's view and where they're coming from. And so I'm just curious, as you're someone who likes to tell stories, if you have any stories of like that not going well, or like how you work through the conflict when it's hard.
I don't think he would mind me telling this story because so much time has passed. Proposition 8 was a huge conflict in our town. And we had every year, a prayer breakfast. We called it the Mayor's Prayer Breakfast. And at that time, our mayor was not pleased with the outcome. Our mayor is now our governor, Gavin Newsom. And he's always had a good relationship with our council. And he came to the prayer breakfast, and he said some things that were very, could be considered offensive to some major religions. And some of the things he said got people to stand up and sit down. Thankfully, nobody walked out. This was 2 days before Thanksgiving, 7 o'clock in the morning. 400 of the most prominent faith and political leaders in San Francisco. I actually ended up going to a conference in India 2 days later. Some of you remember the Taj terrorist attacks. I got stuck in Mumbai. While I was in the airport there, I didn't know what was worse, whether what I was experiencing in Mumbai or what I left behind in San Francisco. My board met, and I was brand new at the time. My board met, and to their credit, they said that there is a difference of opinion on the underlying matter of Prop 8, and so that should not be on the table. The question was, how were religions treated that day? And so a letter was written to the mayor. In fact, the name mayor was taken off the prayer breakfast, and it became the Interfaith Prayer Breakfast as a result. I remember several years later being at a place called Delancey Street, and he put his arm around me, and he goes, "Michael, did you really take the name mayor off prayer breakfast?" And I said, "Can I see a picture of your daughter who had just been born?" And we laughed. But to his credit, when he was elected governor, his father had just passed and my mother had just passed, and he was new to Sacramento, and he asked me to organize, and the Interfaith Council in San Francisco to organize his inauguration morning interfaith service. He didn't want any political people there. He wanted to be there with the clergy. I think he realized the gravity of the responsibility he was about to take on, and he and the first partner, his spouse, it was a tearful moment, but I've always known him to be a person of deep and abiding faith, and I think that when the pandemic began, he looked to us for guidance, both practical and spiritual. And so I think, again, if we always leave a door open and create the space for healing after something happens that doesn't quite go right, then we're doing the right thing.
Thank you also for being here. I may have missed this in your presentation. I was just wondering whether the San Francisco Interfaith Council, do they receive public funding? Then how do you get your operating budget?
Thank you. We do not receive public funding. I think during the pandemic, we were a subcontractor of a main contractor that got public funding to do pandemic outreach. But let me tell you where our money comes from. A lot of it comes from family and community foundations, and that's primarily for our programmatic work. on everything from the census to our homeless work to affordable housing. Right now we have an Interfaith Essential Housing Task Force looking at repurposing properties for affordable essential housing to keep people in San Francisco. Our programmatic work in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery, we have one foundation that is very, very committed to security in houses of worship, which is something that I didn't mention earlier. You know, there was a string of terrorist attacks on houses of worship. And it would be like a mantra. The event would happen, there would be a vigil, the mayor would show up at the vigil, and she would say, people should feel safe when they go to worship. Everybody would nod their head like you're doing now. I would nod my head. And I'd say, but what are we doing about it? And so this particular grant gave us the capacity to take the lead at assembling Homeland Security, the San Francisco Department of Emergency Management and Public Health, every branch of law enforcement, federal, state, and local that are in San Francisco, to partner with advocacy groups like the ADL and from the Jewish Federation as well as the Catholic Archdiocese. They have their own security people. It was the first time we put together a roundtable where these people were talking with one another. And glad we did, because this group hosted a symposium, because there's a lot of grant money that's available to houses of worship to become safer places, more responsible places to take care of those who are coming there. Well, shortly after we had this gathering, which we only anticipated 200 people, and 300 people showed up. Being Greek, I was concerned if we had enough food to feed them. And they came from not just San Francisco, but from throughout the Bay Area. There were 2 attacks in San Francisco on Armenian entities. One, the community center of a church, which was burned to the ground. One, a school, which was vandalized in the most horrible way you could imagine. And because we had set these relationships in place in advance, the resources were there to help respond. And to that degree, another grant helped us following Katrina. For every 2 years, up until the pandemic, we were hosting disaster preparedness workshops for congregations. Because the expectation is that if there is going to be an earthquake, and we live in earthquake country, and we're isolated for 72 hours, the people living in neighborhoods are going to show up at houses of worship, expecting there to be meals, expecting everything to be intact, expecting there to be cots and beds. And so creating relationships in advance, putting disaster plans together in advance, is a way of doing interfaith work, we believe. And so grant monies supported that. We also get monies from all those other constituencies we talked about and some people who believe in our work. Was that helpful? But no public money. Partly because the reporting, you'd need to hire staff just to stay on top of the bureaucracy of it all. But we're intentional that way. Katerina. I've been here 4 days and I know the first names.
Thank you so much for being here. So you touched on this a little in your talk and some questions that you got from Cody, but in the United States, we kind of like to think of the idea that we have a separation of church and state, which is not necessarily the case. And you obviously work very close with lots of interfaith organizations. And so from your perspective, how do you see the role of religion within our country, specifically the role of religion in politics? Do you see it as a good thing, as a bad thing, or what should we do in order to kind of create a more just environment for religion and politics going forward, especially with the rise of polarization in our country?
Katerina, I speak to you from the perspective of a 7-mile by 7-mile city that has rather progressive tendencies and yet has still, a constituency that's very diverse, as I mentioned, from the most conservative Orthodox to the most progressive liberal. In the course of this conversation, I've tried to show how religion benefits a city. And I don't think it should be penalized because it does that. I remember talking to a group after we had to deal with something very, very mundane. And I said to them, we won this time. I said, but I think that you should very much seriously consider becoming members of your merchant association in your neighborhood and your neighborhood association, because you're both. You're members of the community. And get to know your neighbors, because when you need allies for important issues, you shouldn't be cultivating them in the middle of a crisis. You really should. You're in the neighborhood doing good. Get to know your neighbors, and your neighborhoods will be better. And so that's my way of answering that question. I do not believe that religions should try to walk over the First Amendment rights, and certainly not to take rights away from others. That's my personal belief. I think that an overwhelming number of people from our council would believe that as well.
We have time for one more question.
You get to ask the first question and the last question, Wims.
Your personal beliefs and experiences, is there any way that your work has either fundamentally or in any way altered or challenged your personal beliefs, either politically or religiously, as you work with vastly different people?
As I mentioned at the outset, I assumed this position a year before Prop 8. I had a very close relationship with Mayor Ed Lee, who passed away at a young age. He was sort of like an older brother to me. And I was one of his first appointees to the Human Rights Commission. At that time, the person who had been chairing the LGBT Advisory Committee for the Commission had gone over to the Public Health Commission. Some of you might know her, Cecilia Chung. She was lifted up in one of these mini-series that was out there, We Shall Rise. So I became the chair of that advisory committee that was formed after the assassination of Harvey Milk. Mayor Lee appointed me to that position because he felt that there needed to be healing between some segments of the religious community and some segments of the LGBT community. There's a very large section of welcoming LGBT congregations in San Francisco. I remember, and I will say, like yesterday, there was a piece of legislation advanced by a senator from Southern California, I want to say San Diego, maybe LA, that would make reparative therapy on minors illegal. And we took it up. We had hearings. We encouraged our local leadership to endorse this legislation. They did. It passed. And it was signed by our governor, and other states have taken similar measures. My work on the LGBT Advisory Committee was probably some of the most fulfilling work I had on the Human Rights Commission. And interestingly, I was sort of like the dad of the group, because these were community leaders, and most of them were young. They taught me more than I could teach them. And for that, I'm grateful. I mean, it's the feeling that I've had this week going in to speak with students in the classroom.
Well, that concludes tonight's program. Thank you all so much for coming, and please join me in giving a huge round of applause to our guests.
Thank you.